Jewish tradition teaches that every single night of our lives, we are to recite a prayer that identifies an enemy and begs for protection. In the wake of saying Shema, we pray for peace and shelter and relief and redemption and divine intervention against plague, war, hunger, and more, and then we implore God to save us from Satan. Let us lie down in harmony, we say, and let us arise, our King, to life. Spread over us the mantle of your peace and grant us counsel before you. Save us, shelter us, remove antagonists, maladies, conflicts, famine, and agonies from upon us, and remove Satan from before and behind us. So as the sun sets and dusk turns to dark each night, we open our hearts and catalogue our greatest fears. We beseech heaven for help against the obstacles to our health and piety, and on the basis of this liturgy, it appears at the top of the pyramid of impediments lies Satan. And while Satan's name sits on our lips each evening on the threshold between one day and the next, he features in the pinnacle of our prayers at the threshold between 1 year and the next as well. Right before we sound the shofar on Rosh Hashanah, as we get to our feet and endeavor to achieve a mental serenity, we as a community intone 6 verses intended to defeat Satan in secret. Hear my plea, we say. Do not close your ears to my appeal, to my screams. Truth is the essence of your word. Your justice is eternal. So on the loom of our liturgy, we weave the words of a king and a prophet into an impressive weft that expresses both our despair and our desires. Invoking Jeremiah's lamentation over the collapse of our capital and the exile of our nation, we plead for God's attention and then cite 5 lines from Psalm 119. But as we evoke the themes of law and loss and lament and longing in explicit terms, our voice emit an imperceptible request, an undetectable address in the outskirts of the sound. The first letter of each of the 6 verses serves as an acrostic, and when each of the opening syllables are sequestered from the rest of their sentences and pieced together in heaven, they make a piercing appeal. Kara Satan, shred Satan. So in the moments before we sound the shofar, when we center our attention on heaven and who we are to be, we voice a veiled plea, disguising our petition beneath layers of prayers to evade adverse detection and seek the extermination of Satan. So this is my question. Who is Satan? Who is this figure that haunts our nights and our years? Who is this sinister being that plagues our peace and appears in our prayers? Who is this creature that seeks our demise and flies in the face of our dreams and our destiny? Who is he? Where does he come from? What does he want? And how can we defeat him? Now, over the course of time, Satan has taken many forms. In the 20th century, C.S. Lewis depicted him as the head of a colossal bureaucracy intent on sending people to hell. And in the 14th century, Dante Alighieri represented him as a beast, frozen at the center of an inferno, feasting on history's 3 greatest traitors. And he has been painted by poets and preachers and composers in a whole range of ways, from Geoffrey Chaucer to William Blake and Mark Twain to The Good Place. But today I wish to distill just 2 opposing views on who Satan is and what we should be thinking when we say those 6 verses before we sound the shofar. First, we will turn to an English poet and then to a rabbinic sage. John Milton, the 17th century pamphleteer, politician, and public intellectual, who was imprisoned for his opposition to the monarchy, is perhaps best known for his epic poem that depicts the fall of humankind and the loss of paradise. But despite a cast of characters that includes Adam and Eve and teams with a whole host of angels and the presence of God himself, Satan is for many the most compelling figure in Paradise Lost. Milton's Satan has provoked both loathing and admiration among the greatest of critics, from those who see him as a walking, talking personification of narcissism and malice, and those who see him as a hero and a revolutionary. Harold Bloom, the great late literary critic, confessed to having been in love with his superb personality, the magnificence of his pathos, and he hails him as a hero-villain surpassing even Shakespeare's Richard III, Edmund, Iago, and Macbeth. Milton's Satan is a gripping figure who, despite his evil, evokes sympathy in the reader. And for one writer, the American reader in particular, for in this critic's words, the antagonist of the epic poem was a self-made individualistic iconoclast. In Milton's rendering, based on a tradition that leads back to 3 verses, in the 14th chapter of Isaiah, Satan began as a bright star. He was Lucifer, the Latin translation of Hallel ben Shechar, which literally means the bearer of light. Lucifer was an archangel who reigned in heaven, along with Michael and Gabriel beneath only God. But ambition and jealousy drove Lucifer to assemble a rabble of rebel angels and launch an offensive against God. And as a consequence of the inexorable, inevitable defeat, Lucifer fell both in stature and in space into a new pocket of the cosmos called hell. And it was here, in hell, that Lucifer earned a new name, Satan. Milton's poem begins with the Titanic former angel waking on the surface of a burning lake, where a dense and visible darkness fills the cavernous deep. He lifts his gargantuan head and opens his enormous eyes to see the ruins of his attempted rebellion, and gazes at the frames of his now demonic followers cast across the shadowy flames like a heap of leaves after the fall. Satan then spends the next 9 books of the poem attempting to avenge his defeat, knowing that he cannot beat God, but can taint his replacement creation, humankind. But first, Satan founds his capital city, Pandemonium, rallies his disciples and takes to the podium and utters the words steeped in ego and ambition for which he is most known. Better to reign in hell than serve in heaven. And what makes Satan so sympathetic, so compelling and memorable is his emotional depth. Because unlike the unchangeable angels who we are told never shed their smile, Satan has mood swings. He has moments of lucidity and shame amidst militant spite. He entertains penitence and laments his rebellion before he lies to angels to enter paradise. And though his mission is the end of men, he is at first mesmerized by their beauty. But most of all, Satan admits that he is in pain. And he confesses that the central aim of his unforgiving campaign is to relieve his agony. In his words, only in destroying I find ease to my relentless thoughts. And upon first seeing Adam and Eve, he gives a speech in which we get to see his suffering. Sight hateful, sight tormenting, thus these two in paradise in one another's arms, the happier Eden shall enjoy their fill of bliss on bliss, while I to hell am thrust, where neither joy nor love, but fierce desire, among our other torments not the least, still unfulfilled with pain of longing pines. Satan envies human love and bliss. He covets their equanimity and companionship, but despite his sympathetic and compelling character, he is, in Milton's depiction, the root of all evil. He is the progenitor of sin and death and the devil that possessed a serpent and tempted our mother and our father to fall. He is a disruptor who defiled us out of spite, who envied our innocence, was instrumental in our dissidence, diminished our position, and relished our eviction from Eden. He is an enemy to the good, an adversary to the just, a nemesis and antagonist who seeks our downfall and failure and pain. And for those who adopt Milton's picture of Satan, when we pray for protection from his ploys, we are asking for armor against schemes and conspiracies that wish us ill. We pray for a celestial defense against an exterior malice, against a figure that is, for all his tantalizing delight, manifest evil. So that is the first answer to our question of who is Satan. But the perspective of the sage Rabbi Levi could not be more different. For him, Satan's biblical debut is not a feat of exegesis and appears neither in Isaiah or Eden, but in a narrative that catalogues catastrophe in which he is explicitly named in the book of Job. The book begins by introducing us to a wealthy man living a life of apparent piety, described as tam v'yashar, wholesome and upright, and then turns our attention to the heavenly realm. And it was on that day that divine beings presented themselves before God, Satan among them. And on this particular day, which tradition designates as Rosh Hashanah, God and Satan enter into a conversation, one in which the latter accuses Job of possessing a piety of expedience, a product of his opulence that would wither under pressure. So in response, God bids Satan to afflict Job in every way other than bodily harm, a task that in itself leads one of the sages to express sympathy for Satan, suggesting that his challenge was harder in many ways than Job's. Satan's struggle, he says, was more severe than Job's, compared to a servant whose master said, "Break this barrel, but protect the wine." So what seems already apparent is that for the sages, Satan is no fallen angel angling for God's power. He is an agent of God who answers to God, appeals to God, submits to God, and while perhaps malicious, awaits his permission. But the sage Rabbi Levi goes even further and offers the most radical departure from the view later embraced by Milton. Rabbi Levi said Satan's intentions were for the sake of heaven, l'shem shamayim. Seeing that God had begun to favor Job, Satan said to himself, "Heaven forfend that he forget the love of Abraham." Satan, far from the former Lucifer who seethed with anger and schemed with spite, acted for Rabbi Levi with pious purpose. He sought the sufferings of Job only to show the devotion of Abraham. He sought to try Job's patience only to remind the world of a piety that transcended pain, to recall the righteousness of a figure who was willing to leave his father and sacrifice his son for the sake of a prophecy that he could not begin to fathom. Satan in this depiction is less a villain than a hero, a member of the celestial retinue who remains unsatisfied with superficial piety and is in search of tested virtue. And then the Talmud, in reporting Rabbi Levi's view, tells of another sage repeating that teaching with an astonishing effect. Rav Achar bar Yaakov taught, and then Satan came and kissed his feet. Satan, for these sages, is capable of affection for human beings, not simply in moments of passing lucidity, but as an expression of his deepest drive. He is not intent on our failure. He is not hell-bent on our fall. He is committed to eliciting the greatest piety and defending the faith of those who have fought to keep it alive. And when we recognize that, he bows at our feet. So now we've seen two views on the subject of who Satan is, one in which he is a disgruntled former angel committed to our demise, and the other in which he is an agent of heaven willing to afflict us to produce more piety. So now we can return to our opening question and the 6 verses that we say before sounding the shofar on Rosh Hashanah. And the truth is, tradition teaches that so much about the shofar on Rosh Hashanah is focused on Satan. It teaches that we sound it every day of the month before to confuse him. It teaches that we keep it quiet on the day before to confuse him. And it teaches that we sound it in 2 installments on the day itself to confuse him. And of course, we say these 6 verses emitting an encrypted hymn, pleading for his fissure. And while for Milton and a whole slew of mystics in our tradition, our prayer when we say Kara Satan is for the annihilation of an extrinsic evil, for the weaponization of heaven against the heirs of its previous residents. For Rabbi Levi, our prayer is much more about our hubris and moral amnesia. So while for Milton the forces of evil and the source of sin is ulterior, Rabbi Levi invites us in invoking Satan to consider ourselves. When we aim to confuse him and pray for God to remove him, we are pleading for a world in which our piety requires no tests, a world in which our devotion is more than merely evident, but signals a deep well of unwavering faith. We want the shofar not to serve as a talisman that targets the ghosts of a primeval treason, but as an instrument that reminds us of the need to eliminate traces of expedience and to forge an abiding piety. When we utter the 6 prophetic and poetic verses intoning in phonetic code, Kara Satan, asking for the fissure of Satan, perhaps we are not simply asked for Satan to be ripped apart, but for Satan to do the ripping, to shred his suspicions about our conduct. We ask that in the words of Rashi, our most famed medieval commentator, when Satan hears that we love the commandments, he seals his lips. And every night when we pray for peace and shelter and relief and redemption and divine intervention against plague and war, and then implore God to save us from Satan, we are not referring to an internecine celestial conflict in which human beings are collateral damage. We are asking that our faith be spared the trials that seek to deepen it. We ask that our fervor be seen as sincere, that our zeal be seen as earnest, and that our devotion to God and to each other signals our truest selves. This has been among the most trying years in global terms in recent memory. And our trials have taught us much about who we are, what we need, and where our values lie. And it is my deepest prayer that the coming year, 5781, should be one without pain or distress, one without trials or tests, one in which we are simply blessed with health, success, peace, and joy. Shana Tova.